Prophetic Patterns, 1888, and Our Time. So the first set at the top have to do with 1888. The set at the bottom have to do with what happened around 1973 and on. So I'm going to go and discuss this a little bit. I'm going to move here. So now I want you to notice where there's times of hiding and times where there's an unhiding. So we have the Civil War around 1863, and there was a hiding at that time of the 1843 and 1850 charts, and the 1863 chart was made to replace that. And the Seventh-day Adventist Church became an organization at that time. Then in 1884, we have the Blair Bill, which was a bill to create Sunday law in the United States, and it almost passed all but one vote, and A.T. Jones was raised to fight against that. And then we have the Minneapolis Conference in 1888, where A.T. Jones and E.J. Wagner and Ellen White talked about righteousness by faith, talked about prophecy, and talked about the law, the Ten Commandments, uplifting all of those things. We have an increase of homegrown terrorism with the Ku Klux Klan. We have an increase beginning for recovery with supporting recovery from alcohol use and drug abuse, and Ellen White started to speak out and say that yes, these were good things. If a person felt called to do it, by all means do that, but the church needed to not get involved in that because it was going to at some point be connected with Sunday legislation. And we also have a time where the mental health movement in the United States was influenced by some of Ellen White's writings. We need to recognize that, I believe, as well as recognize other factors with that. And between 1888 and 1889, Ellen White and Sigmund Freud, who was the founder of psychology, both agreed and came out publicly talking about the high amount of sexual abuse in the United States. In 1889, Sigmund Freud recanted his statements about incest and sexual abuse and came up with some other theory to discount that. Then 1888, you notice the arrow here, is a time where the Holy Spirit was poured out. And in 1889, Ellen White made a statement in the 5th volume of the Testimonies that people who had accepted the 1888 message said that that whole year had been the best year of their life. There's one other period of time in which this happened, and that was at the ending of the 1335, after the first disappointment and going through the midnight cry and up through October 22 of 1844. That's why I have the number 1335 there. Then, in 1893, Ellen White started to make statements that there was not one person in 20 whose name was registered on the church books who could be assured of salvation if their life had ended. Then we have World War I starting July 28, 2014, ending November 11, 2018. Islam played a role with that, with an assassination that started World War I. Ellen White died in 1915. There was a hiding of her writings with the conference in 1915, discounting her writings. And the first video discussed the time from 1863 through 1915. I have one correction. I accidentally stated that the World War I ended November 11, 2018. My dyslexia kicked in. I apologize. That was in 1918, not 2018. So now I'm going to go to the lower end and discuss this part here. So in 1969, the Vietnam War dramatically increased. It actually had been increasing for several years. It's a war that began in the 50s before Kennedy was president. And in 1969, the SGA conference president increased hiring people who were proof texters, which was the closest that anyone had experience or teachings similar to using Miller's rules, and decreased hiring of those who use the historical critical method. This led to those who taught righteousness by faith being people who were well versed in the Bible and Ellen White and not using the historical critical method. So Bill Lehman was at the Campus Hill Adventist Church from 1972 to 1977. I mark this as 1973 because that's the point where I noticed a real full outpouring of the Holy Spirit, and that went on for several years. And I talk about this in the videos. Then, after 5 years, at least, of this blessing, wonderful blessing, best time that anyone could have within the Adventist Church, Desmond Ford began to promote his teachings, which were, I believe, were false teachings. And he was at the Pacific Union College Church from 1977 to 1980. And the Glacier View Conference was in August of 1980. The 2300 days were discounted. The Millerite charts were discounted. Ellen White was discounted. So you can look that up in Wikipedia. Then, so we have a 5-year time where the Holy Spirit was really being poured out. And then something came in, some false teachings too, that had a real effect on how righteousness by faith was taught after that. And then we have the Iranian hostage crisis, the role that Islam took from Iran. And this was from November 4 of 1979, and it ended January 20, 1981, with the inauguration of Ronald Reagan. And so this is what I call the rumblings of the third woe. And with this, Ronald Reagan took a role leading up to what he did with Russia and the interactions with the Pope that no one knew about at the time, that came to fruition with the events on November 8, 1989. I have a whole video series that you can refer to that I'm in 1973. So as I was saying, there's a whole video series with the Awaken Ministries site about what happened with the events of November 8, 1989. And if you want to look that up, you can also look it up by Googling about that event. So I want to point out that during this time, we had an increase in the role of Ronald Reagan. We had an increase in the role of the religious right, taking their agenda to the public arena and becoming involved in politics. And many of their issues people endorsed and still endorse without fully understanding all of the biblical teachings around that. There was a split in the Baptist church during this time. They split down the middle because half of the church believed in separation of church and state, and half of them did not. So that's just one example. And there was also a hiding of the Religious Liberty Department in the Seventh-day Adventist Church during this time. They quit being a watchdog. So then, with the events of Ronald Reagan and Russia and the fall of the Berlin Wall and the role that the Pope took with that, although most people didn't know it at the time, around this time there began a progression of events. There was an increase in homegrown terrorism, white supremacists white supremacists in the United States and terrorist acts that they did. The most notable was the Oklahoma bombing. So you look at that, and you look at what happened here with the Ku Klux Klan between 1888 and 1889. There was an increase in the role of mental health and an increase in people talking about sexual abuse, an increase in recovery from drugs and alcohol and services and support to that. My own belief is that God supports this, especially during times when people cannot become free from these issues by connection with the church. Because what was the church doing? They were involving themselves in politics more than involving themselves in recovery or healing, spiritual and mental healing. So then around 1994, there were a lot of strong efforts to discount sexual abuse, and there still are. And that was during Clinton's administration. So I want to come down here. I think this is going to shut off on me soon. It's interesting to note that there was a 10-year war between Russia and Afghanistan from 1979 to 1989. So here we have the Iranian hostage crisis in 1979, and we also have the 10-year war between Russia and Afghanistan, and this led up to what happened with the fall of Russia or the USSR on November 8 of 1989. So that's going to end this video series. If you have feedback, please. So just a few more comments. I'm still learning to do things line upon line, and I take everything to the Seven Thunders, which are events that are marked from the Millerite time through, and then up to our time beginning actually in 1989. I want to point out some things. There's two hidings, one in 1863, one in 1915. There's an opening up or less hiding from 1969, and then things starting to get hidden again after that, at a time after that, beginning probably in 1980. Notice when there's Islam. Islam between here, World War I, Islam here. Notice also times when these events happened, and there was the Sunday law. Knowing that there was a Sunday law here, these things came after there was an increase of events by the religious right. There's some interesting things happening that played out in all of this. So if any of you have feedback on other lines to put with this for doing line upon line, please provide that feedback. But I do notice that on these times here, on 1888 and 1973, there was an angel. There was an outpouring of the Holy Spirit. So we have a number of things happening that we can learn from. They may be opposite polarities, possibly, but it's well worth our time to study this way. We learn things even if we don't fully understand it. And in the videos that you watch, you can certainly see that I've learned a lot since doing the videos. And I will, my presentations will show that. Thank you. Bye.